I have my quilt squares all cut out. These are the squares. The strips are in a different stack. But as you can see, I've laid out some of my quilt squares. This is what I do when I'm starting to sew the squares together. I've already got a couple of the squares sewn together. And as you can see, my boys are very interested in what I'm doing. So, the first thing I do is lay out my squares, and then I take 2 pieces at a time and sew them together. Because I am very good at mixing them up if I just take a stack to the sewing machine. So you might be able to just take the stack and do a better job of it. But for now, I'm going to take 2 at a time and go over to my sewing machine. And I'm going to start sewing these together. Now, because I'm using so many different colors, I'm using white thread to sew the quilt together. And I probably will quilt it with white thread also. Now, a couple of things to be careful of. Be sure that your seams are all 1/4 inch, as exact as you can make them. Okay, so we just have to be very careful that we're using a 1/4 inch seam to sew these together with. I'm going to do a little back stitch. And my little thread cutter doesn't always work. Now I'm going to get the other square on that row. Put them right sides together. So now I have the first row of this square. Now I go on to the next row. Now I'm in the habit of using a little back stitch to block the stitches on each piece, but when you're sewing these squares together, the seams to sew them together will lock the stitches in on the individual pieces. Okay, so now we have all three pieces sewn together. So I'm taking all three rows that I've gotten sewn together, and I'm going to press the seams down. And I'm going to press the seam toward the darker square. Alright, so back to the sewing machine. And I always stack the fabric pieces the way that they're going to be sewn back together. So I'm going to sew the first two strips of 3 squares. And I usually take time to go ahead and trim my threads. And I don't know if you've ever seen any scissors like this, but these are just the handiest things I have ever seen. I actually bought these at a quilt show. But if I can find where they're for sale, excuse me, we have a young man walking by. But I don't suppose you have to trim all these threads because they won't be seen. They'll be inside the quilt sandwich, but I always like to trim them anyway. But by pressing the seams down toward the darker pieces, then they fit right together while you're sewing them. Now to measure your seam allowance, the 1/4 inch seam allowance, there are different ways to do that. My sewing machine has the little hash marks. The little hash marks. And I'm using the 1/4 inch over here, if you can see that. But if your sewing machine doesn't have that, then you can put a piece of masking tape. Just put it along the edge. Just lay it like this ruler along the edge and make sure your fabric's following the edge of that tape. I try to keep my trim threads all together so that it makes cleanup easier. Okay, so here is another quilt square that is ready to go. So, in an effort to keep this video a little bit shorter than last time, we'll talk about sewing the squares together, the 9-patch squares, with the connecting pieces. We'll do that next week. See you then.